Armand, I think you should go ahead.
Thank you, Jonathan. So you'll do the spotlight thing, and then we'll move from there. Great.
Spotlight on.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever it is that you are in the world. I want to welcome you all to our dialogue today, titled Disability and Inclusion in the Workplace, the Untapped Labor Force. My name is Dr. Armand Bam, and I head up the Social Impact Portfolio at Stellenbosch Business School. Disability as part of diversity remains on the fringes, with a conservative estimate of 10% of the global population living with disability and 80% of this population remaining unemployed in Sub-Saharan Africa. The inclusion in economic opportunities therefore requires attention. While South Africa became one of the first signatories to the full protocol of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2007, little progress has been made with the inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace. Furthermore, the provisions of the Employment Equity Act, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, the Code of Good Practice on the Employment of Persons with Disabilities, and Technical Assistance Guide to Employment of Persons with Disabilities has been ineffective in compelling business leaders to explore this untapped labor force. The purpose of today's discussion is to explore varying perspectives and practices that address the inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace, as well as where these failures rest. With me today is Professor Michael Steyn from Harvard University, Mr. Raymond Moxley from Queensland University of Technology, Dr. Karina Venter, Stellenbosch University, and Mr. Ferdinand Mettler from Stellenbosch Business School. I want to welcome the panelists and thank them in advance for their contribution and look forward to our dialogue and discussion. For those of you attending, our session will start off with each panelist providing a position statement and sharing their experiences of inclusion in the workplace. Once each panelist has concluded, we will then move into a discussion session amongst ourselves and also progress to a Q&A session with those of you in attendance. So on to who it is that we will have as our first speaker. I would like to introduce Professor Michael Steyn. Professor Steyn is the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School since 2005. Considered one of the world's leading experts on disability law and policy, Dr. Steyn participated in drafting the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Works also with disabled people's organizations and NGOs around the world, and is actively consulting with governments on their disability laws and policies. He advises an array of UN bodies and national human rights institutions and has brought landmark disability rights litigation globally. Professor Steyn has received numerous awards in recognition of his transformative work, including the National Order of Merit, Ecuador, the inaugural Morton E. Ruderman Prize for Inclusion, the inaugural Henry Viscardi Achievement Award, and the ABA Paul G. Hearn Award. His authoritative and path-breaking scholarship of over 247 publications and 9 edited volumes have been published worldwide by leading journals and academic presses, and has been supported by fellowships and awards from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Institute on Disability Rehabilitation and Research, amongst others. Dr. Steyn teaches at Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and Harvard Extension School. He holds an extraordinary professorship at the University of Pretoria's Center for Human Rights and is a visiting professor at the Free University of Amsterdam's Athena Institute. He earned a JD from Harvard Law School, where he became the first known person with a disability to be a member of the Harvard Law Review. and a PhD from Cambridge University. Professor Steyn previously was professor and Cable professor at William and Mary Law School and taught at New York University School of Law and Stanford Law School. He was appointed by President Obama to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. I want to invite Professor Steyn to share his position statement and thoughts.
Thank you ever so much for having me, and it's as always a joy to be in South Africa, although virtually rather than in person. And my remarks will be provocative, and then we can circle back during the discussion and the Q&A and see whatever it is that is of interest to you. My provocative remarks are that I've been studying disability and employment and writing in it and advocating for it and being on the board of various organizations ranging from the US National Organization on Disability to small sort of NGOs that place individuals with disabilities. And I've done that for 30 years. And while I tend to be an optimistic and happy sort of bouncy person, employment, as I've confessed to Dr. Bam during his visit, is the one area in which I do not see progress relating to people with disabilities. I have seen no evidence as far as numerical evidence of progress. And I see a very large tsunami called artificial intelligence on the horizon, which is going to eliminate many 800 million jobs. And I really am worried and wonder about where people with disabilities will fall in that. So disability, has a cultural aspect to it. And although our cultures and our resources and our sociologies are different, the stigma related to disability is millennia old and exists in every single country, nearly. There are accounts of certain indigenous groups that don't see disability as being different, or Aboriginals or Northern Canadians and so on. But basically, it's a group that's stigmatized, and one of the ways in which it is stigmatized is the notion that you either are disabled, in which case you cannot work, or you can work, in which case you are not disabled. And as in most binaries, the truth is in the middle, right? And that's why we have notions of reasonable accommodations and other ideas to keep people in the workplace and get them in. Nevertheless, I've seen zero progress in 30 years, and that includes the United States, where we have failed miserably under the employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act for reasons that I'm happy to go on about it if you like. But bouncing back up, since Dr. Bam had mentioned the CRPD, bouncing back up to the international realm, I note that people with disabilities were not even on the table. The Millennium Compact, which was my lovely and now departed colleague, John Rogi, never included the word disability. The Developing Business and Human Rights Treaty does not include disability other than referencing it among the plethora of international human rights agreements. And by the way, there has been 2 pieces in total written on business and human rights and disability, 2 in the entire world, and I wrote both of them. And that's not to brag, that is to commiserate. Disability is just not considered part of that. If we look at the Fortune 500, CSR, corporate social responsibility, did nothing about disability. And I'm being provocative, but I can back this up. And DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least 95% of the Fortune 500's DEI plans do not mention disability at all. Instead, disability is seen as a pain in the rear, a compliance issue, something that must be done in order to include this various population. But the idea of welcoming people with disabilities, the idea that everyone is accommodated at some point and in some respect is not accepted. The idea that we should have the sort of political correctness or wokeness, which I'm not advocating for, but for all other groups, and yet not apply it to disability, seems to be the pervasive culture. So I worry about how it is we're going to get traction on it. If we look at recent history, we see post 2008, 2009, the global economic downturn, one of the first things that the OECD countries did was to remove social protections and inclusion from persons with disabilities and other vulnerable populations. If we look at COVID, which is continuing in parts of the world, we see that again, states did that firsthand. So how do we turn this corner? How do we get around? Several thoughts just to provoke you and then to stop. One is, are we doing wrong by focusing on targeted populations rather than on focusing on the corporate culture? In my experience of working with companies, it is those that view culture as needing to include everyone regardless of their body type, nationality, faith, and so on, that do better on the overall numbers than the ones who have siloed and discrete programs. Can we include the CEO and some accountability? I've heard no end of CEOs who talk about how they want talent and the best people available, and I don't doubt their sincerity. But if we look at what comes out of the black box of hiring, the numbers have not changed in at least the 30 years that I've been viewing it, and I would wager at least another 60 to 600 years before that. So do we need to actually have a CEO sitting on top of the HR manager and saying to her or him, I'm going to be keeping account of these numbers? Can we do something regarding the stigma of disability that exists among the population and put responsibility on those individuals to self-disclose? Corporations rightly complain that they believe in their day-to-day existence that they have more employees with disabilities than are willing to agree, even in anonymous surveys, that they have disabilities. So certainly that's partly a responsibility of the corporation to change culture, but it also has to do with lack of disability pride, as lack of comfort levels, and the result is often self-accommodation, in which case perhaps these individuals are not being as productive as they might be. So those are some questions. The other question is the role of governments. We have found across the world that certain things work better than others. Particular types of quota systems, particular types, can work better than others. Affirmative action does work. The idea, for example, included in South Africa's Equity Act, but not really in practice, that all individuals are entitled to accommodations. So it's not specifically about disability. Can these things help move things forward? I wonder, I try. I see pilot programs. So those are my very intense provocations so that perhaps we can have a very good and active dialogue. And I'll stop here, and thank you so much for having me with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Steyn. I think that's giving us a bit of food for thought there. I think your local context and the global context, that sets us up very nicely for further discussion and questioning. At this stage, I would like to welcome Dr. Venter to give us her position statement and share some of her experiences. Dr. Venter is a lecturer in musicology at Stellenbosch University and at present also the chair of the South African Society for Research in Music. Her career has been one of immense structural and academic privilege, commencing with a BMus degree at the University of Pretoria and an MMus at Stellenbosch University, prior to reading for a master's and doctorate in musicology from the University of Oxford, where she studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. She is currently in the second year of reading for an MBA at Stellenbosch University Business School, and her research generally the interest centers on music, violence, and historical trauma, the lingering legacies of apartheid, and disability inclusion and the politics of disability more broadly. She has published locally and internationally and is motivated to think, write, and teach at the intersections of music, politics, feminist thought, and those questions that perpetually threaten our present. I'd like to welcome Karina.
Thank you so much, Armand. Thank you, colleagues, and it's wonderful to be able to join you today. I am going to give a position piece of around 15 minutes, and I've titled this the institutionalized uses of disability, 2 reorientations. In this short provocation, I follow the conjuncture of 2 words, use and disability. I ask, what are the institutionalized uses of disability in the workplace, and how might those uses be reorientated towards the forging of a different workplace, a different future? What positions this short provocation is a body of literature and a body of lived experience as a 37-year-old individual, female, white, blind, privileged, Afrikaans speaking, who works at and believes in the university, broken as that institution might be. What I argue is not restricted to the university. Before I begin, I want to place on the periphery of this conversation some acknowledgements. When I commenced my MBA at Stellenbosch Business School, neither I nor the business school knew exactly what to expect. Over the past 2 years, we have negotiated many difficult junctures. I honor the SBS and Jaco Volskenk in particular for their continued engagement. I also want to acknowledge my classmates, some of them are here, they know who they are, and also staff at the disability unit. Finally, I wish to thank Armand Bam, my supervisor, but also a trusted colleague and a fellow thinker. The engagements I've had at SBS have given me hope for the university and hope for a different future in the workplace. What happens when we put these 2 words, use and disability, into conversation? Use can tell us a great deal about disability. Use, as Sarah Ahmed notes, is a busy word, a sweaty verb. Disability is the opposite type of word to use, inviting associations with deficiency, restricted use, or uselessness. As is so often the case, the Afrikaans language amplifies that which is painful, shameful, broken in a word. Gestremd, a word imported from the tongue of the Dutch colonizer, from the word stram, meaning difficult, blockage, tight, constraint. Unlike the English word disability, the Afrikaans word gestremd does not contain the promise of ability, even negated ability, as in disability. To enter the workplace as a person with a disability is to cause a blockage. It is to make things difficult, stram. If use is a busy word, then disability transfers that busyness onto others, onto those not labeled as disabled. Others are made busy by the demands, the problems, the requirements, the accommodations, the stramheid of disability. The first institutionalized use of disability in the workplace is that it poses a problem. This one learns quickly that moment the disabled body attempts to leave behind the paralysis society has scripted for her, him or they. And here I digress, a first digression to explain what I mean. Digression 1. As she reaches out to the university where she wishes to enroll for further studies, she knows the default Oxford behind her name provides her with social capital. This is confirmed to her when she rings the university to discuss her studies. The person on the other side of the line is not confronted with a swaggering email signature proclaiming Doctor and Oxford. Rather, Mrs. Secretary is confronted with a prospective student whose voice at most betrays race and gender. She explains the reason for her call. She's an applicant, visually impaired, and would like to discuss accessibility. Mrs. Secretary is surprised to hear about her visual impairment. How will you cope with drafts? Pop out the inevitable question. She knows she's posing a problem. She tells Mrs. Secretary she took calculus at university, not even knowing why she's divulging this information and thinking silently that this woman, whoever she is, needn't concern herself. She's angry. Adapted lines from Audre Lorde pulse through her body. Quote, "My response to ableism is anger. I have lived with that anger, on that anger, beneath that anger, on top of that anger, ignoring that anger, feeding upon that anger, learning to use that anger before it lays my visions to waste." End quote. End of digression 1. The ignorance that underpins those questions born of disability as problem. How will you cope with drafts? How did you learn to speak? How did you learn to play chess? How do you type on your computer? How does your phone work? How do you know where you are? How, like a howling, hungry animal in ravenous pursuit of easy prey. The very thoughtlessness underpinning these questions attests to a failure of thinking that enables the institutional use of disability as problem. It is also a failure of social environment, but that failure is merely an outflow of a different kind of failure, which I'm calling a failure of thinking. In arguing this, I am guilty of silencing well-meaning how questions, which is not my intention. More still, on countless occasions, those how questions provide openings for social engagement, moments that signal to the ableist world that I'm not so fiercely other, that engagement might be risked. Humorous answers to some of the how questions are at the heart of the tried and trusted party tricks of the disabled person who knows that humor at the expense of disability is a means of making others comfortable around disability. The how questions are useful social openings then, but they are also products of thoughtlessness and the result of a society where disability has been rendered invisible, groups of people to be hidden away in separate schools, separate social circles, separate workplaces. This is the first reorientation I want to leave with you. When confronted with the institutionalized use of disability as problem, in other words, when confronted by those perceptions and how questions born of disability as problem, think, first think, ask what prejudices are masked by those how questions. Keep on asking those how questions, but remain open to anger and to thought as pedagogical moments. One is to learn to unlearn one's privilege, to adapt lines from post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak. The same failure of thinking that enabled the systematic dehumanization of millions in the name of apartheid is the failure of thinking that feeds ableism. I began by speaking about disability as problem and blockage. There is another and intimately connected side to this discourse. If disability is problem, then it is a word loaded with potential and overcoming. The second institutionalized use of disability I want to talk about is disability as inspiration and overcoming. And here I digress again, digression 2. She walks into her first week of lectures. What she hears is that she's an inspiration. She hears this from fellow students who has known her for barely 5 minutes. She hears it from secretaries and lecturers. Status conferred, she is an inspiration. She has always been that, nothing more, nothing less. Her matric results were good enough to excite a media frenzy. No able-bodied student with her results attracted that much attention. But then again, she is no able-bodied student. Her studies at Oxford continued to earn her the identity of inspiration. She's tired of inspiring others. Things are cheap. Above all, she knows there is an underside to inspiration. A lecturer playfully chides the rest of the class when they are unable to find a document on the virtual learning platform. Even Karina could find the document. Surely it can't be that difficult. That is the other side of inspiration. She approaches the Christchurch Library entrance one day on her way to work a shift at the front desk. As always, the college is full of visitors who soak up the past imperial spoils and all. As she takes a handful of steps to the entrance, one of these visitors extends a helpful word. The notice on the door says, "For private use," the visitor tells her. She understands immediately. She isn't to use this door. It is for members of the college only, not for visitors. She is blind. Blind people don't make it to Christchurch, let alone have reason to enter the library. That is the other side of inspiration. Now she's walking on St. Aldate's approaching Cornmarket. It is late. Behind her, someone rather drunk shouts, "Fucking blind person." That is the other side of inspiration. And inspiration and a convenient prop for a joke in which she is the lowest bar for the rest of the students in a class. An inspiration for going to Oxford and an intruder who, because blind, cannot be anything other than a visitor to an Oxford college. An inspiration and a fucking blind person. End of digression 2. I want to propose that these outwardly contradicting statements are two sides of the same coin. On the one side, inspiration and overcoming. On the other, dysfunctionality, a problem. As Joshua St. Pierre and Daniel Pierce, two disabled individuals and scholars, write so poignantly, and I quote, "Stories about us are boring, as predictable and ubiquitous as they are dangerous. Norm-made narrations of our lives are as straight as they come, one-dimensional narratives of tragic loss and or progressive normativity. We are dying or overcoming. We become a burden or an inspiration. We desire vindication or marriage. Our entire narrative worlds are defined by our otherness, yet revolve around the normates and the normative. If we didn't know us better, we would bore us." End of quote. Overcoming or dying, this double bind, two sides of one reality, is typical of inspiration porn, as in pornography, a notion made famous by Stella Young, disabled activist and comedian. Inspiration porn is the label given disabled bodies who achieve either ordinary or extraordinary feats. A disabled person may be an inspiration merely for climbing stairs, for looking at a graph, or for not getting lost. Or a disabled person might be an inspiration for some extraordinary physical, athletic, or mental feat. Inspiration porn binds together the desirable and the undesired, as Jan Groen notes, and I quote, "Desirable but undesired, therein lies the potential for fantasy. A sharp mind compensates for a weak body. Blindness implies second sight or special insights." Or, as is the case with Paralympic athletes, impairment begets extraordinary willpower, leading to extraordinary achievement, end quote. Overcoming or dying, desirable or undesired, inspiration or fucking blind person. I want to suggest that inspiration depends on the continued production of the fucking blind person, the problem, that overcoming depends on the continued production of disability as problem, that the desirable depends on the continued production of the undesired and disability as undesired. Put too simplistically, the disabled body remains inspirational as long as systemically it is reproduced as undesirable and as a problem. This means that disability as inspiration depends on the systemic dysfunction of its continued production. I am an inspiration as long as bodies like mine are systemically excluded. The very system that excludes such bodies, universities, public spaces, social networks, continue to mark the overcoming disabled body as inspiration. My second reorientation, and with this I conclude, when disabled bodies appear as inspirational, ask first about the layers of systemic dysfunction that render such bodies inspirational and act on that dysfunction rather than capitalizing on disabled bodies as inspirational. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karina. There's lots of food for thought there, and I'm also looking forward to circling back and interrogating quite a bit of what you've shared with us. So thank you for that. At this stage, we're going to change a little pace. We're going to find ourselves in another part of the world. We're going to transition to somewhere where I think it's just after 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Raymond Moxley. Raymond is well known to me, a good friend of mine as well. We've been friends for a number of years. And he has a lived experience as someone with a disability, specifically a significant vision impairment. Through his lifetime involvement in the Australian vision impaired community, he has observed the high levels of unemployment and general underemployment of people with a disability. This has influenced his current career change. He has worked as a self-employed real estate agent, specializing in commercial office accommodation for the past 30 years. However, now approaching the end of a double degree in psychology and social work, plans to work to support people with a disability. I'd like to welcome Raymond Moxley.
Thank you very much, Armand. Really a pleasure to be part of this today. Admittedly at 2 a.m. So if I do speak and don't sound quite as coherent as the other guests, please forgive me for that. I'll talk a little about, I guess, the accommodation funding that supports people with a disability in Australia, and probably more specifically people with a vision impairment, because that's a community that I'm a part of and the community that I have the greatest understanding of of how that works. So I will probably repeat a little bit of the ground that's already been covered by our speakers, because I guess these things are all fairly interconnected. So prospects in Australia, specifically for people who have a severe vision impairment, considered to be something, unemployment is considered in that community to be something in the area of 60 to 70%. And those people who do have employment, almost all are regarded as being underemployed. And I think if you spoke to someone with a vision impairment in Australia, you'd probably find that they would reflect that that situation for themselves. For me, I am self-employed. I've always been self-employed. Well, in saying that, I started immediately after leaving school working with my father, because he had a child with a disability who he couldn't work out what to do. So he needed to provide a supported working place, in essence, for me. And that's provided me with a job that I've had for over 30 years. However, it's probably a glorified part-time job, and it's a job that I wouldn't be able to do if I was employed in the private sector, because I simply can't service the market that I deal with in the way that someone without a disability would be able to, in that my vision impairment would limit what I could do. I think workplaces are now far more accommodating than they would have been 30 years ago, and 30 years ago that this wasn't even a consideration. And now I think there's a bit more flexibility and understanding around that than there was then. But to explain a little bit about the support that's offered for people with a disability in Australia, specifically around workplace and workplace modifications. The federal government runs a scheme called the Workplace Modification Scheme. Now, it's targeted to support people with a disability to have their workplaces modified, so that the burden of cost associated with making office adaptations or workplace adaptations, that's taken away from the employer, so that just removes the barrier that I guess an employer may have if they were to look at taking on someone with a disability. That is a useful scheme. However, it is limited in that, for me, the best, I find anyway for myself, the best adaptive software are things where the support that I require is integrated into a normal piece of software. So, for instance, my iPhone, I get that to read to me, or my iPad or whatever. I mean, those things, the access is interlinked into what it's designed as part of the architecture of the software, and that makes it much easier for me to access things rather than having added on bits of technology. Unfortunately, the Workplace Modifications Scheme doesn't support that type of modification, and they would rather sell me a $3,000 in Australian money, so 30,000 Rand piece of equipment that does some specific magnifying, rather than allowing me to buy a mobile phone that would be half the price that has that same magnification capability built into it. So you're not having to carry around a swag full of adaptive technology just to I guess be able to function in a normal way. The other complications we've had in the support for people with a disability is the privatisation of employment job agencies in Australia, and that was something that happened in the late 90s. That had a fairly significant impact also on people with a disability when and probably the generation before me, if you had a disability, particularly if you had vision impairment, if you were very bright and you had support, you'd end up going to law school and be a lawyer. And there are lots of people with vision impairment who are exceptional lawyers in Australia. But if you weren't that way inclined, you ended up working in a supported, in essence, a sheltered workshop. they were called the blind institutes in different states, and people doing sort of put to doing fairly menial tasks, and those things are like putting broom heads on broom handles and making pegs and that sort of thing, which for people who are quite capable, that was fairly demeaning work, but that was considered to be the limit of support that people with a disability were given, particularly, as I said, in the vision impaired community. That had changed, and there was certainly a move towards more acceptance of people in the workplace. And it just started, and then the privatisation has put people on a merry-go-round. It just came to, because the job agencies aren't actually remunerated, or they're remunerated for sending people off to job interviews and having them in their system rather than actually finding them useful employment. So people will find themselves in this endless circle where they will go off to an interview, will get given employment on a probationary basis for something for 13 weeks or something like that, and then that there's really no chance of that employment being supported beyond that, and then they're back in the system again. That becomes quite difficult, and so I guess we're talking about the stigma that the general population has towards disability, but self-stigma comes to the fore then too, in that, and I've known this in my experience. After you've heard for quite a while how limited you may be, you start believing that to be the case, and that can also be a real issue. And we also, and I speak for other people in my community as well, people who are good at self-advocacy are typically not supported. They're considered to be troublemakers because they're being deviant. We're not following the submissive role of someone with a disability. If you're a strong advocate, now that is changing, and obviously people do push beyond that, but there's certainly clear examples where that still is a case. That would be any marginalised community would probably have a similar experience, but I know that definitely is a case in the community of people with disability. The tag also that was mentioned by the previous speaker of the disability porn tag, that is something that also is an inspiration porn, and that's also something that really does wear thin. Just to go around doing your normal daily activities and to be told by someone that you're an inspiration is quite a demeaning thing, and that's not something that is heard infrequently. Unfortunately, it's something that is quite often heard, and that can be a very difficult thing to not rebut. But that's I guess that's the battle that we fight. As far as the other employment supports we have, so we do have the government supported workplace modification scheme. There are two other things that exist that have been fairly life-changing for me in particular, but I know a lot of people with disability, and that is a scheme called the National Disability Insurance Scheme that was rolled out by a previous Labor, so Labor is a left-wing government in Australia, and that was fantastic. It was quite a liberating thing. It provided people, it's targeted, and you have to go through a whole assessment process and continuing assessment process. But the idea is you in essence get given a budget to support your ability to access the community without having to rely on someone else giving up their time to do it. So you've got a budget that I can employ someone to take me shopping, or if I want to take my children to Scouts or pick them up from Scouts, or take them to a sporting event, or go and visit a relative. I don't need to rely on someone to give up their time to go and do that. I've got a budget. I can pay people to do that sort of thing. So that's been quite a liberating thing. However, it becomes a grey area when those funds are used to support people in work. So it will assist you in getting to and from a workplace, but not during your work time. And education supports is something similar. So universities are very accommodating. Everyone sort of trumpets accessibility as their mantra, and that they want to be fully supportive and remove all barriers. But those things tend to be notoriously underfunded. So there's a lot of goodwill, but that doesn't necessarily lead to the access that I guess the general community would accept as being a reasonable accommodation. And that is also an issue that's happening in workplaces. And I had a recent experience actually at university, just in a tutorial group. We were talking about disability acceptance in the workplace, and it's something that has become quite a strong call in the last few years. Workplaces looking at private workplaces reviewing their employment procedures to ensure that they are providing opportunities for people with a disability. And so the one person was part of a large nationwide retail organization, and they were given all of this training to say, well, this is what we're going to be doing. And the question back was, okay, well, when do we expect to see these people coming into the organization? They said, well, we'll just take it very slow and steady at the start. So the intention was there. The intention was to provide training and to provide the perception that they were an accommodating workplace. But as far as actually applying that same enthusiasm to actually employ people with a disability, that was yet to come. So that's a battle, but things, I guess, are progressing, but never as quickly as I'm sure the other people speaking will want to see. And I guess that is also a battle, a bit of a neoliberal discourse battle. You know, apart from the fact that the governments are always wanting to be smaller, it's also sort of conflicts with that state of mind of self-responsibility, and that really does conflict quite a bit with the support that is required for people with a disability to be fully supported in what is even in today's terms still a very ableist world. I've given a bit of a rambling snapshot of what's happening here. I hope that was something that you're after, Armand. There's something a little different to discuss.
Yes, thank you, Raymond. And you know, we've had the discussion around the distinct differences between the South African system and how accommodations are supported. But we'll come back to some of that. You touched on and you fleetingly mentioned the aspect of working for your father and that relationship with your father. And the next speaker I want to introduce is Ferdinand. And Ferdinand works as the Environmental Sustainability Manager in the Grains Division at Tiger Brands. He is an MBA candidate at Stellenbosch Business School. His son was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, non-high functioning, at the age of 10. Currently he's 13 years old, and as Ferdinand describes, he says, I find myself constantly thinking about his accommodative prospects in society when he comes of age. Before the diagnosis, I was uninformed about people with disabilities and never considered it. However, I have become very aware of people with disabilities, especially in the workplace, and have actively engaged in learnerships at Tiger Brands, specifically with a focus on youth and people with disabilities, typically catering for those with no work experience or qualifications. In addition, he is researching workplace inclusion in South African businesses for persons with Asperger's syndrome. And his study aims to identify barriers to inclusion and, if corrected, could allow for more inclusive opportunities for persons with disabilities in corporate South Africa. In conclusion, he describes himself as a concerned parent who struggles to see his son's full inclusion into meaningful employment in South Africa. Ferdinand, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your views as a primary caregiver.
Good. Thank you, Armand, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, I think firstly, it's definitely a privilege to have this platform and to be able to share my experiences and also end off with a provocation and hopefully, and I trust actually, not hopefully, I trust that there would be some good discussion just to kind of alleviate some of the concerns I have for the imminent future for my son diagnosed with Asperger's. I'm going to be sharing one or two slides just to help with contextualizing my experiences. So I'll share that now. Armand, you would just need to give me indication that everything is okay on that side before I start.
So you can go ahead and share. I'll put it in presenter mode and then we can see it.
Okay, so I assume everything is visible and I am audible, and then I'll get going. So the topic which will lead to my key takeaways or provocation is the challenges that primary caregivers, and in this case, primary caregivers as myself, experience when considering possible career prospects for children with disabilities. And in my case, I'm going to focus on autism because that is currently what I'm experiencing. So just in terms of this topic, so we've alluded to it in the introduction, but yeah, why is this important to me? I am a parent of a child that was diagnosed with Asperger's. I find myself currently facilitating or assisting a very difficult educational journey, specifically for kids on the spectrum. And that allows me, or that concerns me, when I start thinking of possibilities and prospects 5 to 10 years from now for this South African citizen that needs to at least find something that, you know, he can be able to contribute towards being a South African citizen and contribute towards the economics of this country, and obviously towards himself in terms of a career prospect. Because I'm struggling with this and I'm in this situation, I require a lot of foresight with regards to what are the possibilities in a medium to long term in terms of possible careers for children exhibiting these types of features, if I can call it that. So I would like to share some of my experiences as a caregiver, and I would feel safe to assume that most caregivers with dealing with this type of situation might be in the same position as me. However, I have not researched that and I've got no theory to offer. So it will just be from my experience. But you need to look at this from my perspective when I start thinking about future prospects and about employment, and I'm looking at where I'm right now and what am I dealing with right now and how will that translate into the possibilities for the future. So when it comes to autism, a lot of children are typically on what we like to call in South Africa individual education plans. Now, these plans typically are a little bit longer than your normal curriculums that able-bodied children would follow at school, which already requires, you know, a longer period in terms of the educational journey that these child would be on. Some curriculums are not specific. It's actually a skill-based, which is a great plus, but it's also difficult for us, you know, in terms of having a child with autism to identify which exactly skill-based would be most preferable. And the reason, therefore, is because of the other issues that I'm going to mention now. You've got communication and language difficulties. Now, you need to think of communication and language difficulties in the sense of future employment. You need to think about the fact that children on the spectrum currently finds it difficult to relate to people. So they need to work with people, and that becomes another barrier, if I can say that. And then at times there is sensory integration, which is also a difficulty with regards to children on the spectrum, and then their behavior and their ways of thinking, and the fact that, you know, they've got a narrow restricted repertoire of thinking. And when I look at all these things that I, as a primary caregiver, is currently experiencing, then I think to myself, how exactly, or how severely rather, would this affect the potential of employability of my child? To answer that question, I actually embarked on the following. I decided to partner with Dr. Baum, and I went into doing research with regards to the state of workplace inclusions for persons with Asperger's syndrome. And here we specifically looked at the case of selected South African corporates. Now, you might wonder, why did I choose South African corporates? Well, you know, South African corporates, most of them in South Africa do run corporate social responsibility programs, and employment inclusion is said to be something that's very important for corporates these days. All right. So I wanted to test that. And also as per the introduction, I also work for a South African corporate. So it was great for me because I'm sort of an inside person, and it would be nice for me to see what am I experiencing and what are other corporates also doing and what are they experiencing. And remember, this was all about, for me, getting to what is that visibility on possible career prospects for my son diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. I'm calling out two of the themes that came from the research. And as I said, this research is currently still in progress. I'm actually submitting this coming Monday. So this is just sharing with what I found. The first one is human resource management. And it seems like HRM processes currently seems exclusionary towards persons with disabilities. So why do I say that? I could not find explicit HRM processes that says this is what we are going to do as a corporate. This is why, this is what we want to achieve, and by when. And should we not be able to achieve our set targets, then, you know, this is what will happen, and this is how we will keep certain people accountable. So with the selected corporates that I've interviewed, that has not come across as clear, which means that it seems as if HRM processes currently is exclusively towards persons with disabilities. And this is general persons with disabilities. This is not just Asperger's. This is disabilities in general. Secondly, I found that workplace accommodations are currently more focused on building accessibility. Now, please understand, building accessibility is very important. It's important that our buildings are accessible, and impaired people in wheelchairs, etc., are able to access buildings and are able to access elevators and all of that stuff. It's very important. So I'm not taking any of the importance away. But what was lacking for me was the fact that I could not find tailor accommodations that was based on specific disabilities to, and I like the word that Raymond used, that will help with, that is as adaptive technology to assist and to enhance workstations. So that was lacking as well. So in this research, I realized that with these lacking items or theory or themes that I've seen, or that came from the research, I thought to myself, how does this position the future for possible employment for my son? And it starts getting a little bit difficult to actually see that possibility of career prospects. And that brings me to my takeaways or my provocation for today. And that's a concern from a primary caregiver, from primary caregivers like myself, in terms of future prospects for children with disabilities, and in my case, children with autism. So when it comes to sheltered employment, businesses, how will businesses, and this is private and government, how will they be able to offer these sheltered employment opportunities for persons on various levels of the autism spectrum? All right. In addition to that, in terms of policy and HRS processes, if we look at the current slow rate of persons with disabilities inclusion, will this still continue for many years to come? And children of today, will they still be experiencing it in the next 5 to 10 years? We've heard some comments from Professor Stein. He talked about 30 years. Are we still at that level where it will still take a long years? And if you look at Professor Stein, and he was talking about, yes, definitely. So that's a concern for me as a primary caregiver. And lastly, South African businesses that are still struggling to reach a 2% PWD inclusion. Whilst there is comprehensive legislation available in South Africa, should that legislation not become more punitive? There was a comment made also by one of the speakers in terms of, do we keep the CEOs accountable? And do they go and sit on top of the HR managers and drivers? So if we are not going to see any of these three key takeaways differently in the next 5 to 10 years, then I would like to put it out there and say that how will children that's on the autism spectrum, like the child that I have, how will they find any type of meaningful employment in the workplace of today or in the near future. I would like to leave it there, Armand. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferdinand, and thank you for raising those points from your personal perspective. At this stage, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly circle back. There's a couple of points that I thought would get us off discussing. You would have heard each other's presentations, so if I can just raise these points and then we'll enter into a conversation and then we'll open up for some questions from the floor. Michael, I was particularly intrigued by this notion of artificial intelligence and the impact that it will have on jobs in the future. There's a big push towards, at least within a South African context, to continue innovation. We speak quite often about the fourth industrial revolution. And so there was a little bit of the teasing out of that, and your views on where that's actually going to leave us in the next couple of years. And then maybe we can kick off on that. I mean, what are the prospects looking like, and is it all doom and gloom?
Well, it's, I tend to fret a lot. That's part of my job. But we're forecasting globally a loss of 800 million jobs by 2035 or so. And the question is, when jobs are lost, whose jobs will be lost? And if you are a vulnerable population, a marginalized population, however we wish to put it, that is, not part of the general idea of business and corporate globally, that people with disabilities are good workers to be sought after and encouraged and promoted and nurtured and valued, well, then whose jobs are going to be lost? It's a good question. There is an opportunity for people with disabilities as problem solvers, as people who might, depending on their disability, prefer to telecommute and be in the information and communication technology realm, to see this as an opportunity to go and learn more and be better at AI. But if we're following the pattern and practice of the last several millennia, it's going to be people with disabilities, amongst others, who are last in or not in, who will be excluded. I don't know how it's going to come out, but if we follow what we know from what we've seen, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a very pretty ending. So I worry about it now, since we're at a tipping point, and I'm sure I'll be screaming about it in 20 years.
So Ferdinand, you can hear there what Michael's outlook is. You spoke around the notion of political correctness, and so I want to jump to Karina because I was very intrigued around this character you describe as the secretary, and the experience around that. This notion of divulging information and having to go through the rigmarole of explaining who you are, and then this idea of a blockage and a failure that really stimulated my thinking. So how do we address this character, and there's this character, the secretary, in all of us in some ways, right? So what are some of your thoughts around how it is that we're able to address that?
Yes, thanks so much. I mean, I think the way in which I phrase it in my position paper has to do, and this is also partly my own background, as someone embedded in the humanities, and listening to what Michael said, and a fairly bleak prospect for the future. I think there's work that we can do at the level of policy, and that work should continue to happen. But unless there's genuinely a change in our thinking, I think that the progress is going to be incredibly slow. Resource allocation is going to remain limited. So that's a broader answer. How do we address this? How do we address this, Mrs. Secretary? Well, my way to address Mrs. Secretary is, well, at that stage was to do nothing, but in fact, to enroll for the course and to study, and to also pick one's battles, right? You can't address every Mrs. Secretary, and that's also not the point of this. The point of this is to say, there are these thousands of little incidents that occur all the time. Why do they occur? So I guess I'm slightly sidestepping your question, but where I want to put emphasis is at the systemic level, at the level of thinking, and I guess then that circles back to just how the levels of ignorance in relation to disability, and the ways in which it is okay to say deeply discriminating things about disability in the way that you will get skewered if you actually say those things about race. You can still get away with saying those things about disability. Whereas, yeah, if you say it about race, you'll be cancelled, rightly or wrongly. So how do we address Mrs. Secretary? My answer is an appeal to start thinking and to do self-critical work for Mrs. Secretary.
Michael, I'm not sure, you spoke about culture, and since I've opened that and connected there, is there your particular view on that notion of political correctness, addressing Mrs. I think, Karina, it's now going to be a talking point for us. Mrs. Secretary, wherever I go, I'm going to start calling people Mrs. Secretary. Just that, your take on that, Michael?
Well, Karina's remarks, as well as her very powerful provocation, ring true. Let's be South African here for a moment. I chaired a meeting between Business Unity South Africa and the Trades Unions Congress and disabled people's organizations over at University of Western Cape many years ago. And the representative from BUSA, Francois something or other, actually got up and said without any embarrassment or hesitation, and I'm more or less quoting him, people with disabilities are poorer workers than non-disabled persons. They tend to get sick more often, they have greater absenteeism, it takes more to train them, they're very expensive on their accommodations, and so on and so forth. And people were sort of looking at me at this meeting, and I said, well, actually, every study around the globe that looks at these things indicates the opposite. It's for the wrong reasons, because there is not mobility within the labor market. There's not opportunities for advancement and promotion. But every study shows exactly the opposite. Higher retention level, lower absentee rate, because basically they're scared to death to lose their jobs. But it's very interesting that you would, say this. And in some ways, I'm grateful to you for expressing what many others say behind smiles, but don't share. And he said, well, how do you know these things? And I said, well, here's this 200-page article that I wrote. So now I know it's 2003 that article came out, and it's about 2006 or so that we had this conversation. And you might actually like to acquaint yourself with some empirical fact before making these arguments. So there is a lot of culture. And just to put it into a very graphic, concrete example, employers accommodate people all the time, all kinds of different people. And from a strictly economic point of view, if I put on my economics hat, there is no difference in the amount of work lost between the schizophrenic who needs 10 minutes to quiet the voices, or the diabetic who needs 10 minutes for an insulin injection, than for the nicotine addict, otherwise known as smokers, who go outdoors to do that. But the latter one is considered normal, right, quote unquote, and part of doing business, quote unquote, and part of being human, and the first two are not. And that's strictly attitude. It makes no economic difference.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Raymond, Karina was speaking about inspiration porn and this notion of the super crip. And I wanted to come back to that because beyond being somebody who is self-employed, you're also an international cricketer. Raymond is probably well, in his heyday, I don't know at this stage, but in his heyday, he was the fastest blind cricket bowler, feared by many. Just around that idea of this super grip and this inspiration porn, what are the skills and the tools and the mechanisms that you've personally used beyond the notion of humor? And so we get, we've shared that idea of humor being used. What are some of the other, I suppose, skills?
Well, I try not to bristle too much when I'm confronted with that sort of thing. I tend to try to reflect back to the person who I encounter that from, and so I guess I immediately direct the gaze at them and get them to consider what in their life is something that's different or unique. Because it's meant to be honest, I'm just doing what I think is a fairly normal thing. I mean, in the very small sphere of, it's a very, very shallow, small pond, the international blind cricket sphere. So it might sound impressive to be the best or fastest bowler in the world, but I didn't have to beat too many to do that. But to me, it's just my version of normal, and that's really what I try to get across to people when I'm confronted with that. Because I think to say that my experience is anything other than that, I think it doesn't really validate me just as being part of the general community. It separates me from that, which is not what I want. So I'm not sure if that accurately answers your question, but that's what I try. I try to just get people to realize that everyone's life is unique. You know, everyone has something different happening or special happening in their lives. You know, no one lives a more interesting or more valid life than anyone else. So that tends to be my way of combating that. We will have different ways of doing things, but we're all in essence the same.
Thanks, Raymond. Ferdinand, before I open to everybody to ask each other questions, I just wanted to come back to educational journey, and I was curious to know what it is that you as a family have actually decided or planned in terms of your now a deeper understanding. So what are your actual plans with your child?
I think, Armand, before I give my actual plan, I just wanted to say that I think that there's a lot of opportunities in corporate South Africa. You just need to take the JSE Top 40, read the integrated reports and see how much money they are spending on CSR and typically giving to causes, etc., and things like that, which is very, very, very great. But I think in terms of workplace accommodations and doing surveys and understanding and going in depth to see what are the possibilities for employment in terms of workstations, I think there is a lot of possibilities there. And I think that South African corporates aren't really doing that as yet. So there's a lot of possibilities that's being missed. And here I'm talking about all type of disabilities, you know, because there can be manning stations in various places that can actually support various types of disabilities. And I'm speaking from what I've seen in industry. As you know, I've been in industry for many, many, many years. I myself oversee 16 manufacturing facilities, which I travel to regularly. So I've noted a couple of things, you know, which with a little bit of accommodations can actually support a lot of type of disabilities. But anyway, so I just wanted to put it out there. But in terms of myself and in terms of the fact that, you know, I'm sitting on the autism spectrum, my child is actually, you know, the inspiration of a lot of things that I do. And my MBA studies is one of them. I started with the business school doing a PG, a postgraduate diploma in business management. And that was just to make sure that I get the job that I currently have. But then I decided to go into the MBA because I realized, you know, throughout the difficult educational journey, that my son will need a little bit more support. And the typical plans that we as a family have is to, start a small type of business that, is a place where he can actually be employed at, that we as a family, can sustain and trustfully, be able to make something work that can actually sustain him for at least the most part of his adult life. I'm fortunate, and me and my family are fortunate enough to be able to have something that we can put forward. I mean, a lot of South African families are not as fortunate, so I can say the word that I'm very blessed. And from that perspective, I know that my child will financially be okay. But it's about being a constructive South African citizen and contributing and that sense of normality that you also have something that you need to do that's important for you and that you contribute towards, and then at the end of the month there is a bit of a salary that you get. So that's what we as a family have embarked on, Armand. And we're trusting that will come into fruition within the next couple of years. But I can say that my strategic management and my strategic analysis subjects was both with cum laude, so and both of them had my planning for what I want to do, and also my entrepreneurship in the PG dip. So if those results anything to go by, then I think my plan is rock solid at this point in time. Anyway, I digress, but that's what I would like to offer. Thank you, Armand.
Thanks, Ferdinand. So there were a couple of provocations. There were a few things that everyone shared, some prospects and points to consider. I just want to open it amongst ourselves. I know that you would have questions of each other, so the floor is open to you as panelists if there are any questions that you wanted to raise. Karina.
Sorry, I was looking for the raise my hand function, but I just jumped that gun.
Yes, go for it.
Michael, I was listening carefully to what you said, and Raymond, also to what you said, and Fadi. I mean, this thing of a bleak future, and a future that looks really difficult. And one of the things that I've been grappling with is, if we just think about supply and demand, putting on that economics hat, the demand in tertiary education from disabled students or students with disabilities remains fairly low. And so if broadly and rather crudely we can categorize the current system as capitalist, maximizing profits, that sort of thing, there's always going to be the balance sheet, and minorities and disabled students remain a minority, will always draw on the shortest straw. And so I guess a very, very broad question: how do we address this if we are operating in this capitalist profit maximizing environment? Because policy documents surely don't really help. I mean, they put in place individual case-by-case recommendations. They don't really bring about the deep structural change, and we can talk about accountability and those kinds of things. But I don't see much changing unless fundamentally the system changes, or then thinking inside the system changes. So I guess maybe, Michael, it's a question that was sparked by your presentation, and as someone who works in policy, what should change if the system itself doesn't change?
Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Well, that's a beautiful question from Karina. First, we have to divide reality from aspiration. The reality is that studies of the OECD countries, this is done by the World Bank and by the ILO, indicate that not having people with disabilities in the workforce causes them to lose somewhere between 3 and 7% GDP, and that's from middle income and high income countries, not from low income countries. We also have to understand that from a rational employer's perspective, and none of them are rational because they're all prejudiced, using tax incentives and subsidies is actually profitable because you more than balance out the cost of accommodation. But to go to the supply side of it, Karina, I would say we're if we're really being rational and rationality outs, we're also being highly affected by geography. So if we look at the pyramid of who is in the workforce, paying taxes, being self-resourced and secure, and who is receiving it, we would look at the U.S. and say that, post World War II in the 50s, the highlight, we had 6 workers for every 1 person receiving benefits. Now we're roughly at 2.5. Japan has dipped under 1. Japan's under 1. And China's going to crash fairly soon as well because of their aging population. So, in those countries, it makes sense to have every available worker in the workforce. And P.S., we did see a little bit of an uptick on the disability side during the 3 or so years of COVID. If we are to look to Sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, we see the opposite picture, which is something like 40% of the world's youth will be African, which is, wonderful, and you're all going to save us with your natural resources and your people, but does not do very much as far as that balance of necessary workers. There won't be a shortfall of workers, there'll be a surplus of it. And there, of course, there are all kinds of complex, interesting and troubling questions about, well, from a purely rational point of view, wouldn't it make sense to have lots of young, not white people go to Japan, right, and China? But of course, that's not going to happen given other considerations. So it depends on the geography as well. Ultimately, all of this comes down to attitudes regarding who is capable and who is valuable. And even if we constrict valuable to a neoconservative idea of valuable as productive, who do we think is capable of doing that? And most societies are not there yet as far as disability. And most employed people with disabilities are like our friend Raymond. They're self-employed. They are entrepreneurial. They come up with their own solutions, which should tell us that the population is very much into problem solving and being ingenious and being creative. But so far there's a mismatch. So.
Thanks, Michael. Raymond, you're a genius. So I just wanted to come back to Raymond and that experience, and Ferdinand's experience and his engagement with his son. I know in many of our conversations, Raymond, around that particular experience and the influence that a parent has, and it appears that Ferdinand's going the same route of creating his own type of sheltered employment. Your thoughts on that type of approach?
Oh, look, I think that what we really need is the community to accept everybody. I mean, obviously Ferdinand's doing that brilliantly, but it's the community making the accommodations. And I think I'm probably a little influenced by Eric Olin Wright. I'm not sure if he's familiar to anyone, but I've been as part of some study I've been doing this last semester. His book is Real Utopias, so imagining a better world, and a lot of that is, I guess, it is combative to the capitalist system, but there seems to be a community focus and I guess social democracy. I mean, that's really giving everyone equal power, and that's what you do by supporting people, by supporting all people. So I think setting up a support network in the intervening time is what you need to do, because it's pretty clear that that there's no one's worked out how to be fully accommodating. I think someone wrote in the chat box around some societies viewing people with disability in different ways. That certainly is the case, but it's certainly that's certainly the absolute minority where people with disabilities have been seen for their value rather than seen as someone different. I have to apologise. It's nearly 3 a.m. So if I do start rambling, you just got to give me a polite signal to say, mate, you're just talking way too much. You need to zip it, and I won't take offence. Just mute me. You've got the power.
Yeah, well, someone else has the power, but thank you for that. And I just want to come back and push you towards Karina, because you've raised this issue of the systemic challenges that we have, the influence of capitalism. And I just wanted to come back to your response to that, Karina.
No, that was my question, Armand.
No, okay. So you're happy with I know you're happy with the answer. And then we can move on from there.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes left, people. So if there are any questions from the floor, I'll be happy to open that up. It's an opportunity for us just to yes, Ferdinand.
I have to ask this. This was one of my key takeaways at the end of my provocation. So I want to ask Prof. Michael this. So, Prof, you mentioned 30 years. No progress, nice legislation in the States, and I think we've got a similar problem. Also very nice legislation in South Africa, also little progress. So how, if I may ask, how punitive, if any, is that legislation in your country in terms of towards companies not reaching the right levels of inclusion, etc.? Is it punitive at all, or to what level? Can you maybe describe it for me?
The U.S. has been a complete failure, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed originally as an employment statute, which is why all the definitions are in the first part of the statute, and then they added on the public accommodations and all the other stuff, has been a total disaster. And it's been a total disaster because, one, we have little to no enforcement of it. If you go to federal court as a private plaintiff, you lose 95% of the time. The federal government, through the Department of Justice, has never done what it's done for other groups, meaning persons of color and women. They have not used statistical discrimination, which means you look at the numbers of who applies, who's hired, who's not hired. They have never used what are called testers. You get people with and without disabilities, with and without certain races, and you use the numbers and hammer them at that. And we have not committed to that at all. There was an initiative under the Obama administration to require federal contractors, those large multi-billion-dollar entities and others who receive federal money, to do what they're required to do under the Rehabilitation Act, and that is use affirmative hiring practices. And in this case, they said 7% of their workforce should be individuals with disabilities. While I was on the National Organization for Disability, I pushed very strongly for that to be a required number, and I lost. I absolutely lost. It became much like what South Africa, Canada, and others have as an aspiration, and therefore it's been useless. It's been useless. So we've failed on a number of reasons, including lack of enforcement. We also fail for other reasons, such as until the Obamacare, otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act, went in, you had a choice if you had a disability and had medical health needs, and that was either be on public assistance and have that public health insurance, or get rid of your ventilator or your psychotropic medication and enter the workplace and try to survive long enough to get vested into private insurance. And I had a very troubling and interesting conversation at the White House when it came time for CRPD ratification. And I was with a bunch of others, and the president said, I could either spend my political capital on pushing for the CRPD, or I could spend it on the Affordable Care Act, and the best thing I could do for the disabled community is to get you health care, so that you can be in the workplace and not be in danger. And unfortunately, he was right about that. I think he could have done both, but that was the choice. So we've failed dramatically because we don't have it as a policy priority.
Thank you for that comment, Prof. And I must say it's not very heartwarming to hear that, because it seems like we in South Africa are following the same route, unfortunately. But yeah, thank you for your comments.
I wish I had happier ones. This is the one area that I'm not bouncy and optimistic.
Yes, and I think we're well aware the South African situation is pretty much that. There's nothing that truly compels anyone from a legislative perspective. It's still very much in that white paper phase. It's talks. It is nothing that has any sort of significant bite. Colleagues, there's the last 5 minutes. If there's anything from the floor, if anybody has a question. What is the position in Scandinavia concerning disabilities? Michael, do you want to take that in terms of your experience? I can
Sure.
share something.
Scandinavia, or the Nordic model of disability, is cradle to grave supports. And so there are certain places like Norway, which is the wealthiest due to the gas and the oil, where persons with disabilities do not have a financial incentive to go into the workplace. Of course, they have a human incentive in wanting to interact with others, to be connected with things that are larger than themselves, and so on and so forth. But they've been having trouble thinking about how to shift the balance in order to create some incentives to get people into the workforce. Sweden is in a little bit of a different position because their economy downturned. And so they've been cutting social protections quite a lot more. Finland has, again, extraordinary support for people with disabilities, including, our deaf-blind friends not only receive up to 2 translators, one of them can go on trips with them on holidays at the government support. And so these countries are thinking about, how do you create a system which incentivizes people to want to be in the workplace for all the good and not so good reasons, without also endangering them or cutting away their support.
Thanks, Michael. I see Jaco's got a question, and then I will get to Roy's question in the chat.
Thanks, Armand. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
All right. So my question goes to Dr. Venter. She will vouch for the fact that, it's a wonder I can speak. I've had my foot in my mouth so many times that I should rather just keep quiet. But so she's mentioned the example of Mrs. Secretary. So my question is, can she, and please, I've done so many things wrong, so I don't think I should feature in the answer, and I don't think I will, but I just want to preempt. So without ever referring to me, can you give a good an example of the contrary of Mrs. Secretary, of an experience that you've had during your MBA, or maybe in some of your other studies, that you thought this is a fantastic example of how one should behave towards differently abled people?
So yeah, just before you go there, Karina, the tail end of that, I think you're going to address. But I just wanted to say to Jackie, part of this dialogue is creating spaces where we can actually interrogate these perspectives. And so it's meant to be a space of learning and a space of sharing. And so every question is a valued question. Karina?
Thanks, Jaco. Dr. Volskenk, for asking, I think, an honest and an important question. I mean, I can answer that at so many different levels. To take it maybe away from the interpersonal for a moment, I mean, one of the things that struck me the moment I moved to Oxford is that I lived as someone with a different level of dignity, just because of the independence that I had, because of functional infrastructure, because of a fairly functional, I mean, I was able to access study resources fairly quickly. And this is actually just to do with treaties and bizarre copyright things, something called the Marrakesh Treaty, amongst other things. And so it was a very different experience, because in South Africa, what we do, if you're privileged, is you buy your way. You buy yourself out of these marginalizing, almost structural deficiencies. Whereas it was a very different experience. So that is, I guess, answering your question at the level of structure. At a more interpersonal level, I must say that, and I didn't just say that to virtue signal when I prefaced my position piece by saying that the level of earnestness and engagement, the levels of engagement that I've experienced, despite I'm sure me getting it wrong very often and business school getting it wrong, the openness to engage is the one thing that I felt is incredibly valuable in what I've in the past 2 years. And I actually told Armand this the other day, that one can deal with whatever level of exclusion and systemic challenge as long as there's a willingness to reflect, and a willingness to engage, and a willingness to question. And that also goes for myself, right? For myself to be willing to engage, reflect, and question. So it's not a labor that purely I displace on the so-called ableist world. I think at other sort of also smaller things, certainly within the class space, there's a marked difference between students who's done diversity work and who has a certain sense and a certain understanding of that space. And I've certainly had tremendously positive experiences in that realm. And yeah, I don't know, the premium cappuccino you bought me on day 2 was also bloody good.
Bribery, I tell you, is a way to get people. It's called coercion. Thank you, Karina. Michael, I think maybe just Roy's question is regarding the Employment Equity Act, but I think it is a global phenomenon. This notion of, while we have this act, it speaks to the designated groups. Why is it, I'm going to interpret Roy's question, that there is progress made with respect to race, gender, yet disability lags behind?
In the South African context, it may be because of the history of apartheid and the ability to focus on race as a leveling and equity idea. But globally, again, going back to DEI and CSR, disability has always been at the back of the queue, even if indeed it is in the queue at all. And it's kind of ironic because your Employment Equity Act comes from Canada's Employment Equity Act, and that comes from Justice Rosie Abella's Employment Equity Report. And that began with disability and was all about disability, right? Plus some other features in Canada. And yet, as it's been exported, it's been disability that's been left behind. Interestingly, in South Africa's Act, you include, as Canada and others do not, reasonable accommodations for all of the affected groups. And so in some ways, you've been much more progressive and thoughtful, and yet no one has been as inclusive as they ought to be. I can't point to anything other than social stigma.
Thanks, Michael. Colleagues, I don't see any other questions, and if I there, Jonathan, you have your hand up.
Yes, so this is maybe more of a comment, but through my journey as the learning designer here at Stellenbosch Business School, I worked with Karina through some of her activities that she was participating in throughout her journey of her MBA. And one of the areas that I, as a learning architect and designer, felt that I was lacking was the awareness of how to deal with inclusivity in my space that I had. And I had the agency to work through content and well, basically all the content that she was engaging in, but I did not know that these things were not made available, or the content was not made available to her as it was made to able-bodied students. And this put me, as well as my team, under immense pressure and a lot of fear, because we were not necessarily prepared enough. With her assistance, she was very helpful whenever she assisted us with whatever we needed to provide her with. But I realized that there was a lack of awareness within our space to create an inclusive environment for not only Karina, but people that are going to come to our spaces going forward. And I feel that the higher education space was not necessarily aware of creating a space for alternative learning styles, as well as a student that does not accommodate into their norm. This also came from faculty members who were also grossly unprepared to assist Karina, not even aware that she was willing to help us go through the journey. But I feel that there's not enough education around inclusivity in higher education as we go as we are currently standing. And I think we need a little bit more of that. So thank you, Karina, for assisting with that for us.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think, there's a couple of touch points around education, or more so around the aspect of resourcing inclusion, I think, which is a real practical dilemma in higher education space. We're at the end, colleagues. I'm going to ask for a 30-second snap soundbite. Michael, Karina, Raymond, Ferdy, your parting comments as we move on. We've planted a seed now at the Stellenbosch Business School to take these discussions deeper and further. So if I can, Michael, since you started first, I'm going to actually ask you to end off. So we'll go with Ferdinand first. If 30 seconds, your last thoughts and parting words.
I think awareness is very important, and I think we need to ensure that we drive this message through in the communities that we currently operate, be it work or social, etc. And I think that the more people become aware of possibilities and what should be done, that we'll get more support. I think it's just, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but I think people are not aware and people don't know how they can assist and support. So awareness is the key takeaway for me as a parting or as a closing comment. Thank you, Armand.
Thank you, Ferdinand. Karina and I have had discussions around the use of the word ignorance. I think it is very appropriate to say that people are ignorant. So steering away from that political correctness, Michael, people are ignorant. Raymond, your 30 seconds.
Okay. Look, I think everyone should engage in a bit of self-reflection if you want to, and try to consider if you have prejudice that maybe, and where it comes from. Certainly to get an understanding of what someone else's life is like is a difficult thing to do. So I guess that would be the main thing. Have a bit of use self-reflection, but also to understand that someone with a disability, they just have a different normal, but it's normal as well, and it's equally valid, and their experience is equally valid. So the sooner that we can lift the stigma that society has, the sooner that people with disability can remove the self-stigma that they can carry, and we can all fully participate in what's going on. I think that's as good as I can get for 3:10 in the morning. I'm sorry if not as coherent as the others, but that's what I've got.
Thank you, Raymond. I owe you big time for being here. Karina?
So I don't have the excuse of 3:10 in the morning, I'm afraid. And I actually want to echo what Raymond said, which is, whilst I've spoken a lot here about systemic change and deep structural change, at the end we're a room of 30 odd individuals my take home would be reflect deeply, think, read, agitate, challenge, and within your sphere of influence, do the work of inclusivity, actually do the work. It is hard work, it's difficult work, it's labor that's often singularly displaced onto persons with disabilities, and I think joint responsibility would already get us a long way.
Thanks, Karina. I think that notion of a collective effort within the transformation space within our university as a whole is what I think everyone needs to get to grips with. Michael?
Right, I'll end positively. Corporations, and especially multinational corporations, are far better positioned than governments and other policymakers to do a world of social justice for people with disabilities. And by that, I mean not only as employees and managers and shareholders, but also as far as how their blockchains are done and whether they are generating and or supporting inclusive or exclusive design in ICT and in other areas. They can make themselves accessible to customers with disabilities, responsive to customers in the world of disabilities, and project positive imagery. So I'll end with positive encouragement for the corporate sector to actually pick up the ball and do what you do very well in other spheres.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those comments. Just very quickly to Tobeko, unfortunately missed a bit of this due to load shedding. We didn't even go there today. Yes, there will be a recording and it should be available. I want to express my gratitude to Ferdinand, Raymond, Karina, and Michael for taking the time. It's really, for me, a seed that we're planting. For those of you who've attended, we look forward to broadening the conversation and taking it forward. And we look forward to you joining us in the future. Thank you to everybody who has been behind the scenes. John of Janine, thank you for making sure that we had this opportunity. It's always very great to have a team that makes sure that we can share what it is that we are passionate about, and not only passionate about, we're looking forward to making a difference. Look forward to chatting to you all again. Raymond, you may go to bed. I do owe you big time. Michael, thank you very much. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving and the celebrations that you're preparing for. Ferdinand and Karina, I look forward to us completing the rest of the year and handing in some research to the rest of you. Thank you very much and take care.
Thanks, Armand, for hosting. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.